Longines Chronoscope was a 15-minute public affairs interview program broadcast on CBS from 1951 to 1955. The program discussed news issues of the day and featured guests such as elected officials, foreign dignitaries, and other prominent figures. Guests were questioned by journalists from organizations like Newsweek, CBS, American Mercury, and the New York Herald Tribune. Program sponsor Longines Whitnor was a watch company that donated all copies of Chronoscope to the National Archives in order to make them available to researchers and the public. Considering recent events in the Middle East, here's a look at politics in the region in the 1950s. This Longines program from 1953 features Egyptian ambassador to the United States, Mohammed Kamil Abdul Rahim.
It's time for the Longines Chronoscope, a television journal of the important issues of the hour. A presentation of the Longines Whitnor Watch Company, maker of Longines, the world's most honored watch, and Whitnor, distinguished companion to the world-honored Longines. Good evening. This is Frank Knight. May I introduce our co-editors for this edition of the Longines Chronoscope? Mr. William Bradford Huey, editor and analyst, and Mr. Hardy Burt, author and correspondent. Our distinguished guest for this evening is His Excellency Kamil Abdul Rahim, Egyptian ambassador to the United States.
Mr. Ambassador, our viewers are tremendously interested in the great political struggle now going on in the Middle East. And you, sir, with your long and distinguished career in the Egyptian diplomatic service, are particularly well qualified to give us some authoritative information. Now, first of all, sir, your country and Britain have just reached an important agreement over that great area called the Sudan. It's about a third the size of the United States. Now, sir, will you tell our viewers first just what the significance of this agreement is over the Sudan?
This agreement on the Sudan is one of the most important events and one of the, perhaps the only happy news that we have received for a long, long time in the Middle East.
What does Egypt gain out of the agreement?
Well, we gain only solving a long-standing problem. Sudanese have been given the right to self-determination, either to unite with Egypt or to be independent.
In other words, in about 3 or 4 years from now, the Sudanese, that's a third the size of the United States. That great area will choose to be either independent or to become a part of Egypt. Is that correct, sir?
Yes, in 3 years they will have full self-government, and they will be either choose to be independent.
Now, has this agreement eased the tensions between the West and Egypt? Has it made Egypt perhaps friendlier toward Britain and the United States?
I think it has eased the conditions tremendously, and it's not only that, but I think it paved the way for a final and a final solution for the Suez problem.
If the Sudanese do decide after this 3-year period to become independent, what does it mean economically in a loss to Egypt? Does it mean some economic loss?
Not at all. There is no economic loss at all, except we only united with the Sudan by the River Nile, which is the life giver of both countries.
Well, does it mean any loss to the British economically? Because the British get quite a good deal of cotton from the Sudan, I understand.
Well, they get the cotton everywhere now, from the United States, from Peru, from everywhere, and no more now. There's a great shortage of cotton. We want to sell our cotton, but we find some difficulty.
What would be the reaction in Egypt if, after this 3-year period, the Sudanese decided to join up with the British?
Well, I really don't know if they're going to do that. I think this is a very academic question, and the British themselves, they do not feel as the Sudanese is going to join the Commonwealth.
No, but they have the right to do that if they want to.
Well, if they are independent.
Well, sir, now that you've gotten over this first hurdle, the Sudanese hurdle, this week you began conversations with the British over that thorny problem of British troops leaving the Suez. And of course Britain has about 50,000 troops there. Now, your country wants those 50,000 British troops to leave, doesn't it?
Well, surely, because these troops have been in Egypt since 1882, and they came by force, and they still remain there in the Suez Canal.
When do your negotiations start for...
well, we're
making an
hoping to
agreement?
negotiate very soon, perhaps this week. We hope so.
Do you think that the agreement, would you make any predictions as to how it might come out, that the agreement will be that the British troops will leave
if
the
the
Suez?
agreement on the Suez Canal is negotiated on the same spirit that we negotiated the Sudanese question, I have great hopes, and I'm very optimistic of the result.
Well, you want the British to leave, and then does Egypt want to take over, assume the sole responsibility for the protection of the Suez area?
Of course, we are ready to assume the sole responsibility for the Suez area. We have an army of 100,000. We need some equipment. With this equipment, we could be ready to defend our country. And I can assure you, the country can and defend its territory better than any other foreigners.
Do you plan to expand your military power in Egypt?
Well, this is limited to our possibilities of budget and so forth, but you know, our population is 21 million inhabitants. We could raise up to 1 million soldiers.
Well, that brings us to perhaps the most interesting point, sir. Here in America, our policy for a long time has been to expand the military power in the Middle East. The Middle East is a power vacuum. It's an immensely rich area, 60% of the oil reserves of the earth. And we, of course, as an American nation, we want to create a powerful military force in the Middle East, and we want it to be Egypt. Now, first of all, sir, you've said that your country, with 21 million people, you can support an army of 1 million people, can't you?
We can support, but you know, the expenses of a new
That's right.
army.
I mean,
is
you can supply the manpower. For
we
such
can
a force.
supply the manpower, and we could through our budget also help in defraying the expenses.
Mr. Ambassador,
Some of the expenses.
do you see any signs that American policy will be to equip your troops with arms if you expand your armed forces?
Well, I really can't speak on the American policy, but
I say, do you see any signs that that might happen?
well, if the United States finds it for its interest that we'll have a strong Egypt, well equipped, as they found for its interest to have a strong Turkey, well equipped in the northeastern Mediterranean.
Egypt would like to have that kind of aid, though.
Well, we are ready to have this aid, no doubt about it.
Well, I believe it's the announced policy of our State Department now that we want to help create such power as you suggest. And the questions that are in our viewers' minds, I think, are these. First of all, how dependable would a strong Egypt be in the conflict between the West and Russia? Would you be a dependable ally?
We have been always dependable during the last 2 world wars. In the First World War, we rendered great service to our friends, the Western powers.
Of course, I suppose...
In the last World War, we did the same thing. I don't find anything to the contrary for any future war.
Your primary need is airplanes and tanks, I assume.
Airplanes and tanks and anti-air defense.
This is a difficult question to ask you because you can't answer it but one way that I can see, but do you think that the Egyptians are do they have mechanical abilities to handle this technical equipment, the average Egyptian soldier?
The British Suez base is mainly run by Egyptian mechanics, and they have a special capacity in mechanics there, and we can find the people there who could do this job very easily.
Mr. Ambassador, just looking ahead a little bit, suppose you have your army of 1 million, and suppose they're equipped and supplied by the Americans, and maybe you get your training, some of your help in that way. Is there any chance at all of this big armed force being used aggressively against Israel?
I don't think there is any chance at all of that sort, because we need the army for our defense, for the defense of our country. And we have no aggressive intentions whatsoever against anybody. And you know that in 1950 there is a joint declaration of France, Britain and the United States guaranteeing the whole status quo there, and nobody could attack the other.
Well, one of the things most Americans are proud of how Turkey has developed as a military power in that area. We feel that we've gotten more for our money in Turkey than anywhere else, and we feel that the Turkish armored divisions are the best ones facing Russia. Now, do you think that an armed Egypt could cooperate with Turkey in that area, or are you an ancient enemy of the Turks?
No, we are not ancient enemies. We are tied and allied always with the Turks, and we're ready to cooperate with our friends. We call them our cousins, the Turks, because there's a strong relations between Egypt and Turkey for long history.
How are your relations with Russia today in Egypt? Are they better or worse than they were, say, a year or two ago?
Well, I think the same relations with all countries.
Well, coming back to the Turks, sir, the Turkish plan, where they used a dictatorship of Ataturk after the First War, and then they finally evolved into a relatively free nation. Now, do you think you see Egypt evolving somewhat on the Turkish plan? Do you see this dictatorship now and perhaps becoming a free nation in 3 or 4 years from now?
As a matter of fact, we have now in Egypt started on the way of a real democracy. We have a committee now, discussing the principles of a modern constitution for Egypt. And we have now a provisional constitution for Egypt, in which is governed. And we hope after this period of transition, we will have a full parliament and a modern constitution.
Well, sir, now as a final question, Egypt has always been a land of cruel extremes, great wealth for a few, and then perhaps the oldest and poorest peasantry in the world. And you have now begun, I believe, the first land reform in the Middle East. As a final question, sir, will you tell our viewers how that land reform is progressing?
Well, this land reform is progressing very quickly, and today, if you go to Egypt, you will find a new look in Egypt. You will find that there is creating a new middle class of 8 million people, higher wages for agricultural laborers, landless peasants are receiving lots from 3 to 5 acres. Those who lease the land are receiving lower rents. So the result that you will have a higher standard of living for at least 8 million people in the country, with internal economic conditions and consumers' goods and better trade and industry inside the country.
Well, thank you, sir, very much for being with us this evening.
The opinions that you've heard our speakers express tonight have been entirely their own. The editorial board for this edition of the Longines Chronoscope was Mr. William Bradford Huey and Mr. Hardy Burt. Our distinguished guest was His Excellency Kamil Abdul Rahim, Egyptian ambassador to the United States.